In the arid heart of Texas, where bullets counted for more than promises and forgiveness was rarer than water in August, a lone gunfighter discovered that some wounds only heal when drenched in another's blood. But it was the gaze of a mysterious woman who arrived on the last stagecoach before the storm that made him question if anything human still remained beneath the layers of dust and guilt he carried. Have you ever felt the weight of a choice that would change not just your destiny, but that of everyone around you? That's exactly what happened when Jake Sullivan, known in 5 counties as the fastest draw west of the Rio Grande, stopped his horses at the entrance to Dustwater, a town forgotten by God but remembered by the devil. The wind whispered through the loose boards of abandoned buildings, carrying the scent of distant rain and approaching trouble. Jake didn't know it, but in that moment, as he crossed the invisible line separating the desert from dying civilization, he was entering a web of lies, vengeance, and redemption that would test every fiber of his hardened soul. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful silence of a sleeping town, but that heavy silence that precedes a storm, when even the coyotes hide and the buzzards circle too high to be seen. His spurs jingled with every step, the only sound besides the creaking wood under the relentless sun. Jake had ridden 3 days through the desert, following rumors of a job that would pay enough to disappear for good, maybe start clean somewhere his name wasn't whispered with fear. The Golden Dust Saloon stood in the center of the main street like a rotten tooth in a sick mouth. Jake pushed through the swinging doors, and the familiar smell of sweat, cheap whiskey, and despair enveloped him like an old blanket. Half a dozen faces turned his way, eyes that had seen too much and expected to see even more. The bartender, a fat man with pockmarks scarring his face like lunar craters, nodded in silent acknowledgement. That's when he saw her. Sitting alone at a table in the corner, a woman who looked as out of place in that den as a rose in a field of cacti. Hair, black as the desert night, fell in waves over shoulders covered by a dark blue dress that had seen better days. But it was her eyes that stopped him in his tracks. Eyes green as polished jade that seemed to see right through him, past the gun on his hip and the scars on his soul. She looked up from the deck of cards she was shuffling with agile fingers and smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Jake felt something stir inside him, something he had buried along with his partner in a shallow grave 5 years ago. Danger, his instinct whispered, but he was already walking towards her, drawn like a moth to a flame. Sarah McKenna was her name, he discovered after sitting down at the table. A widow, she said, traveling to find relatives in Santa Fe. Jake didn't believe a word of it, but it didn't matter. Out west, everyone was entitled to their lies. She offered a game of cards, and he accepted, knowing they were betting more than money. The hours passed like minutes as they talked between poker hands, each probing the other, looking for weaknesses. The first show of vulnerability came when she dropped a yellowed photograph from her purse. A little girl smiled at the camera, holding a rag doll. Sarah quickly picked it up, but not before Jake saw the raw pain in her eyes. Daughter, he thought, and something bad had happened. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror every morning since that fateful night in Amarillo. The moment was broken by the abrupt entrance of 3 men, cowboys by appearance, but Jake recognized the type. Hired guns in disguise, men who killed for money and slept without nightmares. The leader, a tall fellow with a scar running from his left eye to his chin, swept the saloon with his gaze until it landed on Sarah. He stiffened imperceptibly, but Jake noticed. His fingers moved instinctively closer to his pistol. The tension in the air was palpable, like the humidity before rain. The scarred man approached, his spurs creating a metallic symphony with every step. "Miss McKenna," he said, his voice drawn, out like gravel. "We thought you were lost." Sarah maintained her composure, but Jake saw her hands tremble slightly as she put away the cards. "I'm not lost," she replied, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. Just resting before continuing. "To journey." What happened next was as fast as lightning in the desert sky. The scarred man reached out to grab Sarah's arm, and Jake moved. His chair crashed backward as he stood, his hand already on his gun butt. "I believe the lady said she's resting," his voice cut through the air like a razor. I suggest you gentlemen find somewhere else to drink. The saloon became even quieter if that was possible. Jake knew that silence, the moment before the lead storm. The scarred man grinned, revealing teeth yellowed by tobacco. Who might you be to butt into other people's business, stranger? Jake didn't smile back. Just someone who doesn't like to see a lady bothered. Now get along before I lose my patience. For long seconds, no one moved. Jake could feel the sweat trickling between his shoulder blades, but his hands remained steady. There were 3 of them, and he was outnumbered, but he'd faced worse odds. The scarred man finally backed down, spitting on the wooden floor. This isn't over, he said, his eyes fixed on Sarah. You know what we're looking for. You can't run forever. After the men left, Sarah looked at Jake with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. Why did you do that? You don't know me. Jake picked up his fallen chair and sat back down. In the desert, sometimes the only law is doing what's right, he answered, surprising himself with the sincerity. Besides, I can't stand bullies. Sarah studied his face for a long moment before sighing. They'll be back, she said. And next time they'll bring more men. Jake shrugged. Then you'd better tell me the truth about what they want. Maybe I can help. She hesitated, clearly debating with herself. Finally, as if making a decision that would change everything, she began to speak. The story Sarah told was common in those lawless lands, but no less tragic for it. Her husband had been a small rancher who discovered gold on his land. Before he could file the claim, he was killed by men sent by Colonel Marcus Webb, the most powerful man for 300 miles. Sarah had fled with the claim papers and something Webb desperately wanted. My daughter, she whispered, tears finally escaping. He has her. He said he'll kill her if I don't hand over the documents and the map. Jake felt the familiar anger bubble in his chest, that righteous fury he'd tried to drown with whiskey and distance. An innocent child as a bargaining chip. It was the kind of thing that made him question if God truly looked upon the West, or if he had turned his back long ago. Where is she? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Sarah pulled a folded paper from her bodice. Webb Ranch, 40 miles north. But it's a fortress. He has at least 20 men. 20 men. Jake had faced fewer and nearly died. But the face of that child in the photograph wouldn't leave his mind. It reminded him of another child, in another time, whom he had failed to protect. Perhaps it was time to balance the scales. We need a plan, he said. And allies. I know a few. Men who owe favors. Good men who can't stand to see injustice. Sarah looked at him with something close to hope. Why are you doing this? You have nothing to gain and everything to lose. Jake was silent for a moment, listening to the wind howl outside. 5 years ago, I let my partner die because I chose money over loyalty. I've carried that weight ever since. Maybe it's time to do something right, even if it's the last thing I do. In the days that followed, Jake and Sarah worked together to gather allies. He watched her when she thought he wasn't looking, noticing the strength beneath the fragile appearance, the iron determination of a mother fighting for her child. At night, they sat around the fire on the outskirts of town, planning and sharing stories. It was during one of those nights that the second moment of closeness happened. Sarah had just finished cleaning the dishes from their frugal dinner when distant thunder announced the arrival of a storm. Jake was checking the weapons when she sat beside him, closer than necessary. I had a daughter once, he said suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. She was 6 when the fever took her. My wife followed a week later. That's when I started wandering, trying to forget. Sarah placed her hand over his, her touch soft as a feather. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Losing a child is like losing a piece of your soul. Jake turned his hand to intertwine their fingers. That's why I'm going to bring your girl back, I promise. She squeezed his hand, and in that moment, under the stormy Texas sky, 2 wounded hearts found a thread of connection. The rain began to fall, thick and heavy, turning the dry earth to mud. They took shelter under a rocky overhang, their bodies close to share warmth. Sarah took something from her purse, a small silver locket. It was my mother's, she said, placing it in Jake's hand. For protection, I want you to keep it. Jake protested, but she insisted. Please, I need to know that something of mine is with you when we go after her. Jake put the locket in his pocket, feeling the weight of the gesture. In return, he took off his red bandana, the one he'd worn for years, and tied it gently around her wrist. So you know I'll come back, he said. Sarah touched the fabric as if it were gold, and for a moment, the world outside with all its violence and pain disappeared. Preparing for the rescue took 2 weeks. Jake had gathered 5 men, all with their own reasons to hate Webb. There was Tom Martinez, a Mexican vaquero whose sister had been dishonored by Webb's men, William Black Crow, an Indian tracker whose tribal lands had been stolen, the O'Malley brothers, Irishmen who lost their saloon in a rigged dispute, and Doc Holliday Jr., not the famous gunfighter, but a young doctor who had seen too much suffering caused by Webb. The plan was simple in its audacity. While Jake and the O'Malley brothers created a distraction by attacking Webb's herd, Tom and Black Crow would infiltrate the ranch to locate the girl. Sarah and Doc would wait with fresh horses for the escape. Simple. But Jake knew that simple. Plans were the first to go wrong. The night before the attack, Jake found Sarah standing alone under the stars. The wind had died down, leaving the air still and heavy with tension. "Are you afraid?" she asked without turning. "Always," Jake replied, stopping beside her. "A man who isn't afraid is a dead man waiting to happen. But fear keeps you alive, keeps you alert." Sarah turned to face him, and in the starlight, Jake thought he had never seen anything so beautiful and so sad. "If something happens to me tomorrow," she began. But Jake silenced her by placing a finger on her lips. "Nothing is going to happen. We'll get your daughter and disappear. Start over somewhere Webb can't reach us." "We?" she asked, hope coloring her voice. Jake nodded. "If you'll have me, a weary gunfighter with more past than future." Sarah's answer was to move closer, resting her head on his chest. Jake wrapped his arms around her, feeling something inside him heal, like a broken bone finally setting. They stood like that for long minutes, 2 solitaries finding comfort in each other while the world around them conspired to tear them apart. The attack began at dawn. Jake and the O'Malleys descended on the herd like desert devils, shooting into the air and yelling, scattering the cattle in all directions. As expected, most of Webb's men rode out in pursuit, leaving the ranch with reduced defenses. Jake saw the dust of their horses disappearing on the horizon and smiled grimly. The bait had been taken, but Webb was smarter than they expected. When Tom and Black Crow approached the ranch, they found an ambush waiting. Shots exploded from all directions, and Tom fell from his horse, a red stain spreading on his shirt. Black Crow managed to drag him to cover, but they were trapped. Jake heard the distant gunfire and cursed. The plan had failed. He turned his horse and galloped back, the O'Malleys hot on his heels. They arrived in time to see Webb himself emerge from the main house, dragging a small girl by the arm. Sarah's daughter Elizabeth was no more than 8, but she held her head high despite the fear evident in her eyes. "Sullivan!" Webb yelled, his voice carrying across the distance. "I know you're out there. Come out or the girl pays the price." Jake dismounted, walking slowly into the open. Webb was a big man with a grizzled beard and eyes cold as winter. He held a revolver against Elizabeth's head, using her as a shield. What followed was one of the most tense moments of Jake's life. There he was, facing a man who represented everything he hated in the world, with the life of an innocent child hanging in the balance. "Let the girl go, Webb," Jake said, his voice calm despite his pounding heart. "Your fight is with adults, not children." Webb laughed, a humorless sound. "You've gone soft, Sullivan. I've heard about you. The fastest gun in Texas, they say. But speed is useless when I've got the advantage. Where's the woman? Where are my documents?" That's when Sarah appeared, stepping out from behind a wagon where she had hidden with Doc. "I'm here," her voice clear and strong. "Let my daughter go and you'll have what you want." Webb smiled triumphantly. "Come here, dear." Slowly. Sarah began to walk, each step measured. Jake could see the tension in every line of her body, the effort not to run to her daughter. When she was halfway there, something shifted in the air. Jake felt it before he saw it, that gut feeling that had saved his life so many times. One of Webb's men on the roof was moving his rifle, aiming at Sarah. What happened next took seconds, but it seemed to last an eternity. Jake drew, his movement fluid as water. His first shot knocked the shooter off the roof. The second hit Webb in the shoulder, making him spin and release Elizabeth. The girl ran, and Sarah met her halfway, wrapping her in a desperate embrace. But the battle wasn't over. Webb's remaining men opened fire, and the ranch yard turned into a war zone. Jake dove for cover, reloading as bullets whizzed over his head. The O'Malleys flanked left, Black Crow right, creating a crossfire. In the middle of the chaos, Jake saw Webb crawling towards the house, leaving a trail of blood. He couldn't let him escape. He ran after him, ignoring the bullets splintering the wood around him. He found Webb in the office, trying to open a safe with trembling hands. "It's over, Webb," Jake said, his gun held steady. Webb turned, his face pale from blood loss. "You don't understand," he gasped. "It's not just about gold. There are secrets buried on this land, secrets that could change everything." Jake didn't care about secrets. He only saw a man who had caused too much suffering. But it was Sarah who fired the final shot. She appeared in the doorway, her daughter, protected behind her, and without hesitation pulled the trigger. Webb fell, the secrets he held dying with him. She looked at Jake, and he saw in her not the fragile lady he had met in the saloon, but a woman forged in the fire of adversity, strong as steel. The battle ended shortly after. With Webb dead, his men lost the will to fight. Some fled, others surrendered. Tom survived his wounds thanks to Doc's care. The ranch, by rights, now belonged to Sarah and Elizabeth. That night, as they tended the wounded and buried the dead, Jake found Sarah sitting on the porch, Elizabeth asleep in her lap. He sat beside them, the silence comfortable between them. "Thank you," Sarah finally whispered. "For everything." Jake shook his head. "I'm the one who should thank you. You gave me a reason to fight for something besides survival." Sarah reached out her hand and Jake took it. "What will we do now?" she asked. Jake looked at the horizon where the first stars were beginning to appear. "We can stay, build something here. The ranch needs work, but the land is good. Or we can leave, start clean somewhere else. The choice is yours." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I want to stay. Elizabeth needs a home, stability, and maybe..." She looked at him with those green eyes that first caught his attention. "Maybe she needs a father too." Jake felt something tighten in his chest, an emotion he thought he had lost forever. "If you'll have me," he said, his voice hoarse. A man with blood on his hands trying to find redemption. Sarah's answer was to lean in and kiss him, soft and sweet under the Texas stars. When they parted, Jake touched the locket in his pocket, the one she had given him for protection. "Worked," he said. "It brought me back." Sarah smiled, the first true smile he had seen from her. "It brought us all back." The months that followed were about rebuilding. The Webb Ranch became the McKenna Sullivan Ranch, a name that made Jake smile every time he saw it painted on the entrance arch. He hung up his guns, picking them up only for hunting or protecting the cattle. Sarah transformed the house into a home, erasing the dark traces of Webb with new curtains and laughter. Elizabeth blossomed under their care, calling Jake Dad within a month. She had her mother's strong spirit and was developing a sharp aim, under Jake's careful tutelage, much to Sarah's amused dismay. At night, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the plains. A family forged not by blood, but by choice and love. The men who had fought alongside them became an extended part of this family. Tom stayed on as foreman, his loyalty unwavering. Black Crow built a cabin on the property, teaching Elizabeth about his people's traditions. The O'Malleys opened a new saloon in town, a respectable establishment where families were welcome. Doc set up a clinic, bringing healing to a land that had seen too much violence. But the past has a way of catching up to even those most determined to escape it. 6 months after the battle at the ranch, a stranger rode into town. Tall and dressed, in black with eyes that had seen hell and returned. Jake recognized him immediately. Matthew Barnes, his old partner, the one he thought had died in Amarillo. The confrontation happened in the same saloon where Jake had met Sarah. Barnes walked in just as Jake remembered him, confident and dangerous. The years hadn't been kind to him. Scars marked his face, and there was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Jake," he said, his voice like gravel, "I heard you settled down, turned rancher." Jake kept his hands visible on the table, away from his gun. "Matthew, I thought you were dead." Barnes laughed bitterly. "Almost. Took 3 bullets that night, but I lived. Spent 5 years looking for you. Not for revenge, Jake. To understand why. The guilt Jake had carried for so long threatened to suffocate him. I chose the money," he said simply. "I thought it was worth more than loyalty. I was wrong. I've lived with it ever since." Barnes studied, his face for a long moment. "I heard about Webb, about what you did for that woman and her daughter. Maybe you have changed after all." The 2 men talked late into the night, filling in the lost years. Barnes had become a federal marshal, hunting the worst criminals in the territory. He was on the trail of an outlaw gang planning to rob the town bank. "I need good men," he said, "men I can trust, Jake," and thought of Sarah and Elizabeth waiting at home, of the peaceful life he had built. But he also thought of his debt to Matthew, of the balance that still needed to be struck. The decision was made when Sarah appeared in the saloon doorway, looking for him. She stopped when she saw Barnes, immediately sensing the tension. Jake made the introductions, watching her face as she understood who the stranger was. "This is the man you thought you betrayed," she said. It wasn't a question. Barnes nodded. "And did betray me. But he also redeemed himself, it seems." Sarah walked closer, her presence calming the tension. "Mr. Barnes, we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do afterward. Jake saved my daughter, gave me a new life. If he owes you a debt, we'll help him pay it. Together." And so, for the last time, Jake Sullivan picked up his guns. But this time he wasn't alone. Sarah insisted on joining, proving to be as skilled with a rifle as he was with revolvers. Tom, Black Crow, and the O'Malleys joined them, united not by money, but by loyalty. The battle with the gang was fierce but brief. They attacked at dawn, when the criminals were most vulnerable. Jake and Barnes fought side by side as in the old days, each covering the other's back. When the smoke cleared, the threat had been eliminated, the town saved. Standing among the wreckage, Barnes extended his hand to Jake. "We're square," he said. "The past is buried." Jake shook his hand, feeling the last weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you, Matthew, for giving me a chance to make things right." Barnes smiled, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from him. "Don't thank me, thank that woman of yours. She saw something in you worth saving." Barnes left the next day, promising to visit when he could. Jake watched him disappear on the horizon, finally closing the last chapter of his old life. He returned home to find Sarah and Elizabeth planting flowers in the garden, transforming the arid land into something beautiful. That night, while Elizabeth slept, Jake and Sarah walked under the stars. The air was cool, carrying the scent of distant rain and new possibilities. "Did you ever think it would end up like this?" Sarah asked, intertwining her fingers with his. Jake stopped, turning to face her. "Never allowed myself to dream of it," he admitted. "I thought men like me had no right to happiness." Sarah touched his face, tracing the lines that the years and guilt had etched there. "Everyone has a right to redemption, Jake. Everyone has a right to love. You taught me that." Jake pulled her close, kissing her under the vast Texas sky, sealing the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. The years passed like seasons in the desert, each bringing its own blessings and challenges. The ranch prospered under their combined care. Elizabeth grew strong and independent, eventually marrying Doc's son and starting her own family. Jake and Sarah had 2 children of their own, twins who inherited their father's courage and their mother's wisdom. The West was changing around them. Railroads brought civilization, towns grew, and the era of the gunfighter was coming to an end. But at the McKenna Sullivan Ranch, some traditions remained. Jake taught his children to shoot, but also to use strength wisely. Sarah taught them to read and write, but also the importance of compassion. On an autumn afternoon, 20 years after that first meeting in the saloon, Jake and Sarah sat on the same porch, watching their grandchildren play in the garden she had cultivated from nothing. Jake's hair was gray now, his hands calloused more by honest work than by pulling triggers. Sarah was still beautiful, the lines on her face telling stories of laughter more than tears. "Regrets?" she asked, as she sometimes did when twilight painted the sky red and gold. Jake thought for a moment, then shook his head. "How can I regret the path that brought me to you? Every wrong choice, every bullet fired, every mile in the desert led." To that moment in the saloon, Sarah smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Destiny, then?" "Maybe," Jake replied. "Or maybe just two lost souls who refused to stay lost." The sun set slowly, painting the plains with fiery hues. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and another answered, lonely voices finding companionship in the vastness. Jake squeezed Sarah's hand, feeling the locket still in his pocket after all these years, a reminder of protection and promises kept. The story of Jake Sullivan and Sarah McKenna became legend in those parts, told around campfires and in renovated saloons. A tale of redemption and love found in the most unlikely places, proof that even in the hardened heart of the desert, hope can bloom like a cactus after the rain. But for them, sitting together as the stars began their eternal dance, it wasn't a legend. It was simply life lived fully despite the scars, loved deeply despite the losses. In the Wild West, where justice often came at the barrel of a gun and mercy was rarer than water in the summer, they had found something more precious than gold, the chance to write their own ending. And you, when will you let hope bloom in your desert?